Everyone, and welcome to our fascinating and wonderful presentation today about a timely topic as we enter the holiday season here. My name is Samuel Holliday, and I have the tremendous privilege of serving as Director of Operations and Scholarship for the United States Capitol Historical Society. And we're so grateful that so many of you are taking time out of your busy days in this busy season to learn more about a critical moment in American history. Before we get into today's fascinating and important discussion, I'd like to do a little bit of technical housekeeping about how we like to use this Zoom webinar platform to engage with you, our audience nationwide and worldwide. If you have any content questions for Mr. Fisher throughout the course of today's program, please put those into the Q&A section of the webinar, which looks like two speech bubbles, either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what sort of device you're using to join us today. And Jane will be able to read those questions and put them together and present them to Mr. Fisher throughout the course or at the tail end of today's program. Now, if you have any technical difficulties, you can send those messages to me in the chat section of the webinar. That looks like one speech bubble, either at the top or bottom of your screen. So once again, any content questions for Mr. Fisher can go into the Q&A section. Any technical matters can go into the chat section, and I will deal with those in real time. It's now also my great pleasure to introduce the President and CEO of the United States Capitol Historical Society, Jane Campbell, who will introduce Mr. Fisher and start today's program. Jane?
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you for all you do to bring these programs to life, and to Yanni, our communications director, for finding the best scholars ever. Mr. Fisher, it is an honor to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Great. Let us set the stage. On Christmas night, 1776, George Washington led a harrowing mission across the Delaware to save the American cause for liberty. His soldiers' password was victory or death. 6 months earlier, America declared its independence, but the spirit of 1776 soon subsided to the realities of war. The United States Army was undermanned and overmatched. One horrific defeat followed another, and nearly 5 out of every 6 soldiers' enlistment was ready to expire. Without a show of strength or even hope, the Army would disband, leaving the revolution dead in its womb. But it is in this context that Washington's men crossed the half-frozen Delaware against snow, sleet, and rain to rout the Hessians and reignite the American flame of freedom in our darkest hours. We are so fortunate that our featured guest today to share this remarkable story is Mr. David Hackett Fisher, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for his definitive history, Washington's Crossing. Mr. Fisher is the Warren Professor of History Emeritus at Brandeis University and the author of several books about America's founding. They include Washington's Crossing, Paul Revere's Ride, and his most recent book, African Founders: How Enslaved People Expanded Americans' Ideals. In 2015, Mr. Fisher received the Pritzker Literature Award for Lifetime Achievement in Military Writing. In 2006, he was made an honorary lifetime member of the Society of the Cincinnati. And in 1990, Mr. Fisher was awarded the Carnegie Prize as Massachusetts Professor of the Year. He received his bachelor's degree from Princeton and his PhD from the Johns Hopkins University. Mr. Fisher is going to tell us the story from his perspective of history. And as he does that, think of the questions you have. You can put them in the Q&A, and I will, as Mr. Fisher comes to the end of his time, you'll see me reappear, and we will take questions from the audience and engage in a dialogue. Someone had asked, is this recorded? Yes, this is recorded, and everyone registered will get a link to the recording, and it's available on our website for scholars, for lovers of history across the world. It's a great Christmas story. Mr. Fisher, tell us about what happened.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to talk about this wonderful subject of the Washington's Crossing. in the American Revolution. I'm happy to respond to your questions and to go wherever you want to take the conversation. Shall I leave it open that way, or do you want me just to launch in?
Why don't you launch in and start?
Okay.
And then we'll do questions.
Yes. Well,
Okay.
then let me tell you about how all this inquiry began. The first rule, I got very interested as an undergraduate at Princeton, in Princeton University, and much of all of this went on in that whole area. And I became a history major, and then we were encouraged to walk the ground. We were not allowed to have cars, so we either walked or went out on our bicycles and explored the area where so much American history has happened, and we're in particular drawn to this remarkable story, and that's how it began. All of my work is cast in the idea of history in its original meaning. The word in its original Greek does not mean history as story. It means history as inquiry, asking a question, questions with an open end, questions that we don't know the answers to. And that's what I've always tried to do in all of my books. And that's what's going on in Washington's Crossing. Do you want me to keep talking, or should I wait for your questions? I think you want me to keep talking. Okay. Well, then let me tell you about how we go about doing the research on all of this. What I do is, first of all, I think the first rule in historical writing is go there, get on the ground. And that's what we did. And much of it I did with my classmate, James McPherson. We walked the ground very carefully ourselves. And then we crossed the river and did it as best we could to try to get the feel for what that might have been. We did this at the same time of year. So we had a sense of experiencing not only the place, but also the season, the weather. The weather is a large part of what this story is about. These great events happened in the middle of a very cold winter, and that was a very large part of it. So that was the first part of it. Then after the first rule of going there, then the next was to try to collect the firsthand accounts of what happened. And what we did was to scour both American and British, and in some degree, Hessian German records. I only have 2 years of high school German. And so, though I could pass a language exam, it was not easy for me to do that, but that's what we did. And we tried to get back to primary accounts, that is firsthand accounts, of which there were many on both sides. Most people who were engaged in this event had a sense that history was happening. And so they were very attentive to what happened. And we tried to look as carefully at the British and at the Hessian side of it as we did at the American side. Try to get as much as we could. And then we began to center our inquiries on the choices that people had to make, and I can follow that through as that was the spine of our work, and I might try to follow that through here as well. So the first thing we tried to do was to learn a little bit more about the combatant armies, about both the American, the British, and also the Hessian troops, all the three very different armies, and to try to study firsthand writings by people in all three of those armies as best as we could. And my book describes all of that in detail. In a large part of the book documents that process of study. Then we began to look for primary accounts wherever they are, and they're everywhere. They're all over the country. And again, working primarily from the base of the Library of Congress, we moved out to the historical societies in most of the American states. Many of them were represented here in one way or another. And then we also went to England, and we worked there in the major British collections. Again, always looking primarily for firsthand accounts, people who were there telling the story of what actually happened. And there are hundreds of accounts of these events. I did not do much research in Germany. We did that mostly through German materials online or available through other institutions in Britain or in the United States. But we're able. A lot of the Hessian material has been made available in that way, and so we launched in and then tried to reconstruct the course of events. And what happened was a series of moments. I think of this as a campaign rather than a single act of the crossing of the Delaware. And the campaign spanned many months in 1776. So after we looked at what I call the rebels, and then the regulars, and then the Hessians, we looked at the events starting with the fall of New York, which was an epic disaster for the United States. Everything that could possibly go wrong did. And Washington first is trying to fight the British on Long Island, and then on Lower Manhattan, and then retreating up the island of Manhattan with more battles as he went. And then finally, the first crossing was not of the Delaware River to Trenton, but rather across the Hudson River, as he tried to preserve his army by getting away to New Jersey and retreating west to Pennsylvania. And there were many people who, as this unfolded during the spring and summer of 1775, there were many people who began to first of all discover their own the dynamics of the process of soldiering. These were, on the American side, these were people of considerable experience of war, but they were not professional soldiers, and so they were learning on the job, and they were up against the first team. I note the strength of the British Army, which was really remarkable. It had won major victories in the last war that it fought against the major powers of Europe, and defeated the greatest military power, which was France in that period, in what is called the 7 Years' War in European history. And it was through that many people on both sides who held command in the revolution got their military experience was in that period. And then they began to prepare for this event, and it was extremely difficult. The country was only very loosely controlled by the Continental Congress. The sovereign powers were the states, and each state was very jealous of its powers and of its independence. Not only from Britain, but from each other. And so it was not easy to get all of them working together at the same time. And that was a large part of what George Washington was doing in collaboration with the leaders of the Continental Congress, who were working at it at the same time, in particular, in people like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. Then there was another generation just coming on the scene. One of them was Alexander Hamilton, another was James Madison, and they were Hamilton was a junior officer in the American Army and rose very rapidly and began to become a major decision maker in that process. So what was interesting was that on the American side, decision making was broadly distributed. It was distributed through state groups. It was distributed through the different regiments in the Army. It had a very broad base. And George Washington had a special challenge to leadership. He had to get all of these very independent and cantankerous Americans working together in a common cause. And that proved to be one of his great and extraordinary strengths. He established a kind of moral hegemony by the way he worked with these people. And it's very interesting to see that style of leadership. It was not very heavy-handed, not top-down. Washington was very good at listening, but everybody knew who was in charge. But he listened in a very open process of communication. And that was critically important to him. We have much to learn from the style of leadership that Washington developed by trial and error, severe trials, many errors, through a long period of hard slogging and suffering in what was the most trying time in American history. I'm going to stop there for a moment, unless you want me to keep on chattering away. Do you want me to keep talking?
You know, we have many, many questions, so I think we can start in our conversation. And let me kind of set this. Washington was an interesting leader. You spoke about his leadership style, you know, being a listener, that he didn't have the same kind of traditional education that some of the other founders of the country had. But what was it that made him stand out as the one that people wanted to follow?
It was a cluster of qualities, I would say, and the first was the strength of his commitment to what they always called the cause. They knew what they were about. They knew why they were there, and he never lost sight of that. The other is that he was used to working in an open system where he was clearly in command, but he commanded by listening in meetings with his officers. And he listened very carefully and encouraged them to speak openly. And it was a very open process, very different from the style of leadership in the British Army, which was much more top-down. This had to be more open because he was working with a confederacy of states, and they did not want to be told what to do. And so that was the key to his leadership. We were very lucky in having him there. And he's a kind of he's a distant figure to most Americans. He's familiar. But people don't really know very much about him, about who he was and what he did, and they have he didn't have a lot of formal education, but he was very intelligent and very quick to learn and listen to people around him, but determined to be their leader in ways that they accepted.
And Mr. Fisher, you spoke for a hot minute about the differences amongst the soldiers, that the soldiers that Washington commanded came with a lot of different backgrounds. And so can you describe, what was that like?
Yes.
There were Southern gentlemen who had a certain idea, and others who had a different idea about. Just talk to us about what were those differences, and how did that lead to this?
I think one a good way to approach that is to think about regional differences between different parts of America. The first part, I think, would be New England. And the New Englanders were an extraordinary group of people that had migrated for religious purposes, had founded self-governing colonies from the start, had governed themselves through town meetings, were used to that process. And their regiments in the Revolution had much of that same quality. They were also people of high of learning and intelligence. They prospered in Atlantic trade, and they were affluent, and they could recruit what they needed from their own resources in some degree. But there was always a sense of equality amongst them, not of total equality, but they were accustomed to town meetings in which all males of military age participated. And that open quality extended through these New England regiments. They also were deeply committed to what they were doing. This was a religious cause for them, as well as a political one. And they were firmly fixed on staying the course. And many of his best units were his New England units, who shared all of that in common. And then very different were those from the Chesapeake colonies of Maryland and Virginia. Virginia was by far the largest of the American states, equal to the population of the next two states combined. And it was very top down. And a large part of its population were slaves, unlike New England, which had slaves too, but in very, very small numbers. And Washington himself was a slaveholder. And on a large scale, many of his officers in Virginia and Maryland regiments were also slaveholders. And these regiments were very much top down. And then very different were the middle states. And these populations were very diverse. And the diversity was both ethnic and religious. And so they were a pluralist in their structures. And all of those groups had to come together to combine, single common cause. And Washington's job was to keep them working with one another.
So, Mr. Fisher, take us to that fateful night. George Washington has this diverse collection of people. It's winter, it's cold, it's been a rough patch. Tell us the story of Washington crossing the Delaware, and then tell us the story about how accurate is the painting that every American knows of Washington crossing the Delaware.
Yes.
What really happened that night?
Well, the first thing that happened were a series of epic disasters. And it was the fall of New York, and then the long retreat across New Jersey, and that was very difficult and very stressful. And at the same time, there was a crisis in support for the revolution. Tories were beginning to, loyalists, and as they called themselves, were beginning to take heart from the victory of the British forces in New York and in the Hudson Valley. And they had the sense that history was on their side. And the Hessians were highly professional soldiers. They've been stereotyped in ways that are not accurate. To get into their records and discover that their officers were very highly educated. Their soldiers were highly disciplined and very effective. They often are mocked and degraded in the history books, and they deserve better. What I try to do is to write with respect for both sides in all sides in what was going on here. And when we do that, I think we're more apt to understand what was happening. And then as they retreated, there had been a series of disasters for the American cause. And in the fall of 1776, there was a sense that things were getting very desperate. There was no sign that the French were going to come in as the Americans had hoped. The French were not sure that the American cause was going to succeed. And as defeat followed defeat in the mid part of 1776, people began to hold back from all of this. Some people did. And the core of it, the core people remained firm and committed. But the problem was how to keep going through all of that. And it got to be very desperate at the end. And in early December, the leaders of the American cause, both in the Congress and in the Army, thought, as one of them said, that the game was pretty near up. They thought they were very close to defeat. And all of that was put before a council of Washington's officers, Washington proposing that we had to confront this danger of collapse of the entire cause and what should be done. And it was thought that it was be necessary in the late summer and fall of 1776 that the American army should find some way, even as it was shrinking and in retreat, to take the initiative. It had to find a way to strike back. And they could only succeed if they could do it by surprise, because they were severely outnumbered by British troops. They were outgunned by British artillery, and they had not anything like the resources of the British Empire at their disposal. And so they had to find a way to strike back to get a victory, an important victory. And they discovered that there might be an opportunity, mainly from New Jersey citizens who crossed the Delaware, reporting that the Hessians were in Trenton, that these were highly professional German soldiers. They were deeply fortified in Trenton, but they had been campaigning as hard as the Americans had, and they were not expecting an American attack. And so it was thought that the first thing that they should do was to find a way to attack this Trenton garrison of Hessian troops. And that's what Washington undertook to do. And they planned quite an elaborate campaign of crossing the Delaware River north and south of Trenton, attacking from both sides. As they organized that, everything that possibly could went wrong. The weather turned against them. It turned cold, and a major, massive nor'easter transformed the weather. It turned much colder, and with heavy precipitation, and the river became increasingly dangerous. They had to improvise an armada of small craft, which they did with great difficulty, recruiting boats from up and down the Delaware River, and then crossing in three places, both north of Trenton, then south, and there was to be another crossing directly at Trenton as well. And again, everything that could go wrong did, but they kept at it. And the story is about overcoming a series of setbacks and keeping on going. And Washington and his leaders were critical to that, but then so also were the cadres of people in these very different American units, working together in this common cause with a sense of desperation. They had to succeed in this, or there was a real sense that the cause was lost. And so I tell the story of how they crossed the river, and then they got their strength on the other side. And then they struck at Trenton, and to everybody's amazement, they took the Hessians by surprise and were able to defeat them and to gain possession of the town, and a large part of the Hessian garrison was taken prisoner and taken back across the river. And then the British were quick to respond. General Howe and his brother, Admiral Howe, were quick to mobilize their forces in New York and to send them in great strength across New Jersey toward Washington. And so the campaign went into another round of activity as the British began to take the initiative and marched down along the major, what is now the major highways of Route 1 and the New Jersey Turnpike general area back toward Trenton. And the Americans met them in a battle outside of Trenton, south of Trenton. The Americans retreated to high ground in the south, and there was a major battle, and the Americans defeated the British in that battle at Trenton. And that was an extraordinary event, in the way that it happened. The British attacking, and they were rebuffed. And then Washington called a council after that fight in Trenton, and the question was, what should they do next? And some said, we've won a victory, let's go home. And Washington said, no, it's not enough. He said, I think we have to hit them again, and more decisively. And so they decided, yes, they would launch an attack around and back toward Princeton, to get control of British the British encampments there and all of their supplies, and they did that. That was the next round of this campaign. And as they marched north, there was the second battle at Princeton, and a second victory for the Americans. And this was, in some sense, decisive. This British army was defeated not once, not twice, but 3 times in all of this. And the Americans were able what they did was then to retreat once more across the Delaware. But they had broken British armies and Hessian troops, and gotten an extraordinary advantage. And the result of this was the revival of the spirit of the Continental Congress. And what was still more important was that the French began to think that the American cause could be supported, and they began to make preparations for doing that. So this was a decisive moment in American history, and it turned on a very small group of people and on very particular decisions. And that's what my book is about. It's about people making choices, and choices making a difference, and free people learning to master their own destiny. That's what this book is about.
And what were the most important choices that people made?
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
What were the most important choices that people made at that time?
Well, it was a long series of choices. Some of the first choices, the first choice was whether to fight against the British. The second was how to organize to sustain that effort. And the third was how to support it. And those were the major questions that required hard choices up and down the country, from New England down to the Carolinas. And we can see this happening. There were decisions made in the Continental Congress, but often the most important decisions were made in every state. And then it was the task of leaders in the Congress and in the Army to combine these 13 original states that were very jealous of their own independence, not only of England, but of each other, to get them to keep together. This is a long story that runs throughout American history is the hearing of what 16 generations of cantankerous Yankees struggling to make common cause against in desperate moments. That's what we see going on here, and they did it by trial and error. Many trials, many errors, many things went wrong, many disasters along the way. But they found, I think, Washington was an example of continuing efforts, of not abandoning the cause, to keep on in the face of defeat. And that's what these people did. And I think we have much to learn from the way they went about doing that. They also did it at the same time that they tried to respect the rule of law amongst themselves and within their country. And that's another part of the story which we could talk about at some maybe later.
Well, Mr. Fisher, one thing to just step back, people are still a bit interested, a lot interested in the painting, the famous painting. Does that painting reflect what you learned about the day that Washington crossed the Delaware? I heard.
Sorry, my phone is ringing. Hello, can't talk now. Call later, please. All right. Sorry.
That's okay. No. So I heard you talk once where you indicated that the painting that Washington crosses in the Delaware didn't really reflect what the situation was like. Would you be willing to talk about how do you see that painting, Washington crossing the Delaware, and how accurate is it?
Yes, I think that Loitsy painting is very interesting. I talk at length in my book about this remarkable German painter, Emanuel Loitsy, who came and to create this thing. And it's a picture of many men in that boat, not only of Washington himself, though he dominates the scene, but it's of what he tried to do was to represent the diversity of the American colonies. And you can see that in these individual people. There are African Americans in that boat who were part of the American cause. You'll see there might be a woman in a red jacket. He was just behind the three people at the center who were holding that, James Monroe, who were holding the flag behind George Washington. And then down just below that, I think there's a person who may have been a woman. There were women in these armies, and they were not actually in combat units, but they were part of these units, traveling with them, and very much involved in the whole process. And we can see them and we can see much of this painting is about the weather and about the state of the river. You see the ice flows that were floating in the river as it actually was at that time, and we can get some sense of first of the danger of this moment, of the sense of desperation, and also if you look at the face of determination of these people as they go about it. And I think in all of those ways, Emanuel Loitsy was very true to what happened in this extraordinary moment in American history.
Great. Now, your most recent book about African founders talked about the role of enslaved people and African Americans. Would you tell us about the role of were enslaved people in the Revolutionary Army, and were there other African Americans? What did you learn about that often untold history? You mentioned that you were grateful to see an African American in the painting.
Yeah. Well, I wrote two books that should, I think, have a similar purpose. One was called Albion Sea, about different groups of British people who came to America, and then the African book is about the extraordinary diversity of Africans who were brought to America in chains. These people who came as slaves, they came from many parts of Africa. And my wife and I, my wife Judy, he's a botanist and a biologist, is a scientist and is very much the brain of the operation. And we traveled to Africa. Again, I said the first rule for history writing is go there, get on the ground. So what we did was we went to Africa from Senegambia. We couldn't quite get to Angola. It ran from Senegambia, which is the bulge of Western Africa, down along the coast of Africa, in the countries in Nigeria in particular was very important, and other countries in between. And then it ran down through the Congo to Angola. We went everywhere except Angola. Angola was in a series of civil wars, and it was thought that we could actually, by very complicated ways, get into Angola, but it was not at all clear that we would ever get out again, because the land was Angola was littered with landmines, and everybody advised us that it just was not safe. So the one place we never got to was Angola, and I feel great regret about that for the African book. But we went every place else, and we were amazed to discover, talking to Africans of our age, getting out, working with. We built our own group of people, traveling with young Africans, usually a young African woman who was fluent in quite a number of African languages, of which there are many. And then with African drivers who are mostly African soldiers who drove us around in these places. And Judy and I went together into the countryside, into communities, living in those communities, talking to people. We did this in between our semesters, which was when we could travel, over a period of about 4 years, traveling in January and February. Which was good time to go to these places weather-wise. And we always tried to talk to as many Africans as we could of many different occupations, to visit as many different parts of the countryside as we could. We found that we were welcomed everywhere, and that they took great interest in our inquiries and great pride in their own history. And they were teachers. They became our teachers. And what we did was to learn, the first part of all of this is to learn to listen. And that's how we went about this. And we did exactly the same thing in Britain when we wrote about the British groups coming to America. And I've done it also when I did a book called Champlain's Dream, which was about many different groups of French cultures who came to America. We did the same thing in France, the same way. And I have another book which I would like to do sometime about the Italians and their contribution, mainly through the Italian Renaissance. And I did one of my doctoral fields on Florence and Venice in the Quattrocento. I learned Italian so I could study all of that, and to try to understand the complexity of that culture as well. So we are not merely a country that comes from different countries, but of an immense complexity of British, of African, of all these different groups that came to America. And that's what my work is all about. It's those differences, that this pluralism that I think creates a dynamic that keeps us free. And it's very important that we be not only tolerant of that, but supportive of that diversity. I think that's vital to American history. And most Americans, I think, believe that and embrace it. But there are some who don't. And I find myself working, trying to persuade them in the books that I publish. All of my books are attempts to broaden the base for a free and open society in this country by learning more about its history. That's what I'm about. And I think that's vital to who we are and what we might be, not so much in our own time as in generations to come.
Well, that is extremely aspirational, and I agree with you 100%. Now, let me just ask you this. You know, we sort of look at the legends and stories and, you know, the picture of Washington crossing the Delaware with the American flag Do you think they had the American flag flying on that ship as they crossed?
Probably not. The flag had been invented, but they were flying many flags. This was a confederation of free states, and it's out of this came the American flag with Betsy Ross and all of that, and came also these national figures whom we share in common today. And I think these common historical possessions that we have are critically important to the future of this free and very diverse republic.
And the other sort of legend that people ask about this particular moment is, the legend says that Washington made sure that all of his soldiers read Thomas Paine's American Crisis right before they crossed the Delaware.
Yes, there is some truth to that. That is, they did encourage Thomas Paine in his writings, and I think this was supported by policy. But there were many writers at this time, and Thomas Paine was very prominent. And in particular with the pamphlet called Common Sense. But there were quite a number of others. And yet there were hundreds of pamphlet writers in this period. And there was an outpouring from presses up and down the country in which people are discovering a common cause and writing about it. So it's Thomas Paine probably first amongst equals, but many other people writing in the same way. But Paine had a genius for reaching a broad public. He had a mastery of a language that people would actually read, and he did deserve his reputation, and he reached had a very large reach, for sure. And very important in this whole process.
Thank you. And one of the other questions is, there at this time, some of the subordinate generals, at least stories have been told that there were some of the subordinate generals that were thinking that perhaps we were not. Everyone was not behind General Washington. There was some insubordination abrew. That?
There was some of that. And that's true. Charles Lee is a famous case in point, and there were a few other people like that. But Washington always found working by leading through his councils, leading through councils of war, getting people together. And he would first of all, he would listen. He would set the agenda, and then he would listen. Everybody knew who was in command. But they also knew that this was a man who believed in that to command a free people, he had to have an open system of command. He had to listen, and he was a very good listener that way. And he began to gather around young people like a very young aide, Alexander Hamilton, who helped him to do things like that. And he worked very closely with the leaders in the Continental Congress. He always made very clear that he worked for them. They were the people who appointed him, and he responded to them, and he respected the sovereignty of the Continental Congress, and tried to strengthen the Congress, even as he remained the leader of the army. And that was fundamentally important to maintain. He was determined to maintain civil control of the military, which is what we've always had in this country. Civilian control of the military is fundamental to American history. And I think West Pointers are trained to study that and to learn about it. And we have been able to keep that going throughout our many generations. We've had some people who have tried to break down that system, but the great majority of Americans, I think, support it.
And Mr. Fisher, we're coming toward the end, so I've got about 3 more questions. And I just wanted to set that stage. This is such a fascinating conversation, and I am sure that our listeners are going to be anxiously looking for your books on their Christmas list. Let me ask one question. That you mentioned that many of the soldiers were up against their enlistment moment, and it was a time when it was really important that the Army show some success.
Yes.
What do you imagine, or what do you know from your research that General Washington said to the soldiers to try to encourage them to re-enlist? And
Well, I think what he tried to do was to make clear the larger purpose of what they all called the cause. That's what they spoke of it as, and it was a cause for their fundamental rights. He tried to engage them by reminding them what this was all about, and he was very good at doing that without preaching to them, doing it often more by example than by precept. And it was fundamental to the success of his leadership in the American Revolution. And he drew other people around him who were also dedicated to the rule of law. They all believed, they spoke of it that way, the rule of law. And they were framing constitutions for their own states through all of this. And trying to frame a system of laws that could hold people together. It was an extraordinary moment that way, and one that Americans should remember with pride and with renewed dedication to keeping that going in our own time, which I think most generations of Americans have done.
And so, Mr. Fisher, do you think that, as you said, he led by example more than by talking? When we ask, what did he say? Did he sort of say it individually to groups of soldiers? He didn't stand up and give a, speech that we somehow haven't heard about. But
yes, he did not do a lot of speeches. That was not Washington's strength. He was leading more by the example of his leadership rather than by his speech. And I think that he let other what came out. That's where the work of Thomas Paine was so important, to tell people what the cause was all about. He wanted people to remember why they were fighting and so forth. And but he was also trying to lead in that open way, even though everybody knew that he was their general. So that he did it through open meetings with people in his army, inviting not only sometimes private soldiers, but also civilians were invited to join in some of these sessions. And so there was an open process there. And here again, Washington was important, not only as a leader, but also as a listener.
so I'm going to tell you I'm going to ask you a question, then I'm going to tell you the last question. Last question I want you to speak about is describe what you believe or from your research, Washington, what was the cause to Washington? If he were to say the cause is, what would that finish? Now, before we get to that,
the right of the people in the American colonies to govern themselves. That's what the cause was primarily, and to govern themselves under the rule of law, laws that they himself had passed, constitutions that they had ratified. And that's what he was committed to do. And that became the American way.
And it still is.
Yes.
And
we've kept it going. And I hope we can, I wonder how many generations has it been? 25 years? I think that's getting on toward what, 15 generations since then. And we have to renew this effort in every generation. And so far we've been able, sometimes we've had a disaster, as we did in 1860 when the country came apart. And then we had a terrible civil war with the bloodiest war in American history was when we fought ourselves in 1860. And I hope we never have to do that again. But that was the process that these men got started. They set an example of how we can keep at it.
They absolutely set an example. And, you know, as we look at coming on America's 250th anniversary in just a few years, how do you think we should tell the story of the obstacles?
How about we should tell the story of
of the obstacles that the soldiers
I can't quite hear that word. Of
the obstacles that the soldiers
of the obstacles of the obstacles, yes. Well, I try to do that. The story is I think this is a story about how people overcame obstacles, and it's about some of the principal obstacles were planted deliberately in their path by the British government, and so it was overcoming that, then overcoming the obstacles that grew from the self-governance throughout the systems, throughout the many, getting the states to work together in a common cause. That was a second part of it. And the third was about recovering from defeats, keeping the system going, even in the face of defeats that were punctuated by disasters. And they learned how to do that. And that's what we can learn from them.
Well, Mr. Fisher, your research and your writing is spectacular. And the fact that you were willing to spend an hour with us is really, we're very grateful. We are grateful to all of our listeners who tuned in. We want to remind everybody that we are a small nonprofit organization, and someone wanted to know about where can you get my We the People mug. That's one of the ways you can support the Capitol Historical Society, is by buying our merchandise. That mug is available. So if you just go on our website, you can get that. It's the holiday season. It's the end of the year. It's a time where people think about their charitable giving. So we call it the NPR moment. These public history programs are brought to you only by the contributions of members and friends. We are grateful that this distinguished professor donated his time to us. And we have another one coming up in January. We hope you will join us on January 26th as we celebrate Holocaust Remembrance Day. Excuse me. We will have at that time Dr. Rebecca Erbelding, who wrote a definitive book called Rescue Board: The Untold Story of America's Effort to Rescue the Jews of Europe. So we want to look at another time in history where there was something dramatic and wrong going on, and how did people respond? So we invite you to join us on January 26th. Mr. Fisher, thank you for being with us. Thank you all. Have a wonderful holiday season. We look forward to seeing you in the new year. Be well. Goodbye.
Thank you for having me.